So I began studying the life of John Milton. So you study, you get your hands on a bunch of stuff that you can, and you think, well, how many sessions will I have for this? And then after a while, a guy like John Milton, it doesn't matter how many sessions you have for that, because there's 8 volumes one guy has on Milton, 12 volumes another guy has on Milton. So you have to resign yourself to doing something about Milton. So what I'm going to do is somewhat of a thumbnail sketch of aspects of his life, and what I've entitled it is John Milton, Consequences of the Reformation, or we could say a consequence of the Reformation, because of the time in which he lived in the 1600s, born in 1608. The Reformation had been going on, of course, from 1300s, 1400s, 1500s, but we see in Milton's life that he is indeed, in many ways, a consequence of the Reformation, and we see the consequences of the Reformation going on in him. I got a gizmo. Okay. They say it's so simple, even I can work it. John Milton's grandfather was as they called him, a rigid Papist, which meant an Orthodox Roman Catholic. And so Milton's father, who was John Milton Sr., John Milton was a junior, but he was not junior in any way. John Milton Sr. was disinherited because he embraced Protestantism. But it was his father's own fault because his father had him educated at Christ Church, Oxford. So that's where the influence came. He was converted. His daddy disinherited him, so he had to work for a living. And so he became what they called a scrivener, which was actually a numerous things. We think of a scribe, and he was various things. He was also a musician. Even some of his musical compositions were played at court. We would combine it with a clerk and a lawyer and various things. He was a man of learning, a man of letters, a man of words, he was. And so what we see is that God is preparing John Milton by having a daddy who's a man of literature to train his son in that way as well. All right, so here's just an outline that I came up with just for my own sake, to keep my own brain happy with it. Consequences of the Reformation. First of all, the education process heightened, because the Reformation brought about great learning. The Reformation brought about a return to the Scriptures and therefore learning in all of the sciences as God would bless men. Secondly, and I see this in Milton's early poem on Shakespeare, in which, and we'll talk about it, but he gives a little thing on Shakespeare that he does, which is a beautiful poem, talking about what is Shakespeare's, what is his honor. His honor is not the fact that he is entombed in this beautiful marble tomb. His honor is actually his learning that he passes on to the next generation. And so I see this in a number of men in this time period, so much so that at times you think, well, these guys just wanted fame, because you hear them talking about wanting to be known after they're dead. You think, oh, well, they're just wanting. No, actually, a lot of these guys, they were so imbued with the understanding of using their talent for the glory of God that they wanted it to be used in such a way that God would, after they were dead, they would still be speaking. The second thing, the expositing of the great themes of the faith, Milton's Paradise Lost. That's the great work, that's the epic poem that we're not going to be delving into very much at all. But the Reformation was a time in which they began to explore once again and go back to the foundations of the Scriptures. So the foundations of the Scriptures are Genesis 1, Genesis 2, Genesis 3. And we see this in Milton's Paradise Lost. Thirdly, the birth of liberty Milton's Areopagitica, and it's a great book that's talking about basically liberty, because the Reformation brought about a birth of ideas about liberty, so that we have throughout the world changes in government which kind of issues forth in the Americas when our founders bring forth a document, a constitution, and a kind of government with all of its checks and balances in which the individual actually has rights and freedoms versus what the world had known before that. So we see this in that particular writing. We'll talk about it for just a moment later. Solidarity with suffering believers, Milton's Sonnet 18, Avenge, O Lord, thy slaughtered saints. We see with Calvin's Geneva, a missionary process by which he's sending out men all over the world to preach the gospel. We see it again in the great missionary movement later on. But we see with Milton this appreciation and love for the saints. And so he writes about the Waldensians who were slaughtered on the mountains. And another beautiful poem of his. Let me just say, I know that most everybody here is not going to read all the works of Milton. But let me say this, you should read some of the smaller works, his sonnets on Shakespeare, on the Waldensians, on his blindness, even on Cromwell. It's not a long one. But you will be richer for it if you will take some time to read a few of those. This is an inheritance that we have in the English language that has been much neglected for various reasons. The next, the gospel of the victory of Christ, Milton's Paradise Regained. When I read that, I had no idea what that would be about, but it's about Christ's temptation in the wilderness. He gains for us paradise by not succumbing to the temptations of the devil, showing forth his perfect righteousness, which would later issue forth in his perfect atonement as well. That's how paradise is regained. It was lost in a paradise. It is gained in a wilderness through Christ. That's a smaller work. That's a little bit easier one than the Paradise Lost. And then giving an account to God, and we'll spend most time here. You know, I realize we don't have our 2 o'clock or our 3 o'clock service, and we don't have to be at Travers till 5, so I got extra time this morning. So I won't take too much extra time, but I did want to give you at least a thumbnail sketch of Milton. Okay. The young Milton, his early life. So Milton was 1608 to 1674, really tumultuous times in England that he lived, but that's okay. It produced, these tumultuous times produced in these Christians some tremendous works. So his father is a scrivener, and amateur is in parentheses, because actually he was a good musician. Educated first at home, Milton said, my father destined me from a child to the pursuits of literature and had me daily instructed in the grammar school and by other masters at home. Now, his father wanted him to be at first was either a minister of the gospel or a lawyer. And that was the idea of his father. And little by little, as Milton grows into what God has for him, he talks to his father through poems in which he wishes to convince his father that God has destined him to this work in literature. Though, of course, during Cromwell's reign, he's very much involved in the political activity of England, being a master of languages. His later education was at what the biographers call the famous St. Paul's School for those 1620 to 1625. So this is the time period in which the Americas are the pilgrims are coming to America. The headmaster, Alexander Gill, whom one of the biographers said, who is now known because he was the headmaster of John Milton, but was a master in his own right, historian of the English language. He wrote treatises on the English language. And one of the professors that I listened to on one of the great courses said that he had the earliest recorded reference to Native American words that had become incorporated into the English language. So that's Professor Seth Lear. And Professor Seth Lear, who I enjoyed very, very much, he said, Gill gave to Milton an awareness of the richness of English vocabulary. And Milton was a good student. It is said that he had a larger vocabulary than Shakespeare, so, and as well as a great appreciation for Shakespeare. So as Milton's growing up and he's wrestling with what God would have him to do, he writes a poem to my father, and I'll just read you a few lines out of the poem, in which what he's doing is he is arguing that the use of verse to be a poet or for prose, that this is an important calling in life. And he loved his father very, very much. He says that may your gifts more suitably requite. I want to requite you for what you've given me. Though to requite them suitably would ask returns much nobler and surpassing far the meager stores of verbal gratitude. It's not enough for me to just say thank you. But he says, but such as I possess, I send thee all. In other words, I'll give you all that I have as I give to God for what you have endowed me with, appreciation for the education that his father gave him. And he writes in here, verse is a work divine. It's a work of God. And then he says, the gods love verse. So in Milton's poetry, here are two things which put off some of the moderns. Is that first of all, you have to have a biblical background to understand what he's talking about, because he's going to constantly be referring to the scriptures. So if you haven't read the scriptures, then you're not going to be able to appreciate Milton. And of course, if you're a believer, you can appreciate him all the more. But then he also says the gods love verse, because he was also trained classically, and he incorporates, especially in Paradise Lost, the mythology of Greek and Rome. And so if you don't know the names of all these gods and who they were and how they represented themselves in the literature, it makes it more difficult. So what I do is I keep my mythological dictionary handy with me, like I love dictionaries. So to help me understand what Milton is alluding to. He says, harmonious verse, once again, shall range the courts above. That God will have songs. Heaven will have songs. And indeed, we know that from the book of the Revelation. We see that. And make the starry firmament resound. And even now, the fiery spirit pure that wheels yon circling orbs directs himself their mazy dance with a melody of verse. And then he talked about verses graced of old the feasts of kings, the historic fact that the courts of kings usually required poets and men of letters to write for them. England had its poet laureates. And he says, then sat the bard, a customary guest, to share the banquet, and his length of locks, with beechen honors bound, proposed in verse the characters of heroes and their deeds. What they did was they would write of the heroes of the nation, because things that are set to music, things that are set to in poetry, phrases, the right turn of a phrase. And it is said that Milton added over 600 of his own words or phrases to the English language that he invented. He was an inventor of words. Thyself did counsel me to add the flowers that Galliel boasts, those two, with which the smooth Italian his degenerate speech adorns. Interesting in his argument for reading and literature, he read everything. He read everything. And he said, a Christian, to the pure all things are pure. He takes out of Titus, chapter 2, I think it is, or the end of 1. And basically what he's saying is that a Christian devoted to God can take a piece of literature and can distill out of it the good find in it, even if it's not written by a believer. He says, my voluntary numbers, if you dare to hope longevity and survive your master's funeral pile, not soon absorbed in the oblivion, the Lethean Gulf. In other words, most people write and nobody ever remembers anything that they've written or said, shall to futurity perhaps convey this theme, and by these praises of my sire improve the fathers of a distant age. So he had a great love for his father, and he wanted very much to improve himself upon the education given to him in order that he might honor his father, part of honoring father and mother. Christ College, Cambridge, 1625 to 1632. Got some of his learning there. It was not his favorite place to learn. He had come from a Puritan home, and in some of his own writings, he talks about the fact that because he could not boast of drinking like some of the others or attending to the brothels, that they made light of him. In fact, they called him Christ College, Christ Lady, the Lady of Christ College is what they called him mockingly, because he wasn't virile like them in those ways. But he gained there as well in his learning. A studious retirement, as he called it, 1632 to 1648. For those 16 years, it says that Milton read everything. And it was years of preparation for his work with Cromwell. 1638, education in Italy as well. Education abroad, as you get a learning by going abroad. And he went to Italy, and it is said by some that some believe that he might have met Galileo, who was imprisoned at that time. His education during Cromwell's reign, here we have Charles I, Cromwell, and we would put Charles II on there too. So he lives in this highly volatile political situation in which Charles I is going to lose his head, and Milton is going to be the one who is probably the loudest voice saying it is proper and giving reasoning as why magistrates could lose their heads and for what reasons they could lose their heads. And so he's all in with Cromwell. And in fact, he writes a poem on Cromwell. He writes, Cromwell, our chief of men, who through a cloud, not of war only, but detractions rude, guided by faith and matchless fortitude. So he sees Cromwell as a man of faith, a man of fortitude. And while he promoted Cromwell more than probably anyone else, being a man of letters of his time, he also found fault as Cromwell's reign went on with some of the policies of Cromwell, and he was not afraid to talk about that either. But he writes in that little sonnet, the 16th sonnet, he says, help us to save free conscience. So this is the idea of liberty. That is the birthright of the Reformation. This idea of having your conscience free religiously, and later on to be able to publish books that you wanted to publish without having others censor them. Help us to save free conscience from the paw of hireling wolves whose gospel is their maw. In other words, whose gospel is rule by might and power rather than the free conscience given to men. So he works under Cromwell under the title of Secretary of Foreign Tongues to the Council of State, and he was sometimes called Cromwell's Latin secretary. The business of state being done in Latin, he was extremely fluent in that. Here is his poem on Shakespeare that he writes in 1630 that you could spend a little time with, and I think to your benefit. He writes, what needs my Shakespeare for his honored bones, the labor of an age and pitied piled stones? So he's my Shakespeare because Milton basically, he becomes Milton's because he loves Shakespeare and he loves his writings and he loves learning. And so it's my Shakespeare for his honored bones, the labor of an age in piled stones, or that his hallowed relics should be hid under a starry pointing pyramid. And that's one of the archaisms that he uses. Throughout his writings, he also has an appreciation for words of the past. So at times he'll use words that are out of date and that everybody knows they're out of date. And others have done this as well, purposefully, just out of an appreciation for that. But basically what he's saying is that Shakespeare's great honor isn't his grave that he's been given the marbled stone, or if he should be given a pyramid itself. The pyramids were given to the pharaohs to honor them, but there actually were just tombs. And actually half the time we don't even know who was in them because they robbed one and put the next one in. So what good was it? What good was it? What would have been better for them is if they had left a legacy of some sort of writings or rule in which they would be honored in. And that's what he's saying Shakespeare has instead. He says, dear son of memory. He's 14 years dead at this point when he writes it. He writes this when he's 22 years old. Dear son of memory, great heir of fame, what needest thou such weak witness of thy name? Thou in our wonder and astonishment has built thyself a livelong monument. That's one of those words that he used, all the livelong days. He had a lot of words like that we use now as well. But you see, he's a son of memory because most people are forgotten. That's his real honor, the fact that he is remembered because of his works. Great heir of fame, why do you need such a weak witness of thy name? Thou in our wonder and our astonishment, as we read his works, the wonder and astonishment with his usage of words, that's what's built your monument. For whilst to the shame of slow endeavoring art, that is, the shame of those who try to write poetry and prose, the art of poetry and prose, which often comes very slowly and hard and difficult, and after you've written it, you think you got something pretty good there, but you probably don't. In comparison to most people. For whilst to the shame of slow endeavoring art, thy easy numbers flow. It's like to Shakespeare, it just seemed to flow out of his mouth. And that each heart hath from the leaves of thy unvalued book, the undervaluing of such gifting and labor, those Delphic lines, the Greek god of poetry, the godlike lines, those Delphic lines with deep impression took. Then thou our fancy of itself depriving our imagination. It's almost as though that some of these guys write so well that it deprives us of our own imagination because we can't come up with the things that they come up with or the way that they come up with it. Dost make us marvel with too much conceiving. And so sepulchred in such pomp dost lie that kings for such a tomb would wish to die. So anyways, it's basically just saying that Shakespeare was honored in that what he left behind. And that's what Milton wanted to do. He wanted to leave something behind. So here's Paradise Lost, a Homeric epic, an epic poem. And this is indeed what he left behind. He left behind this great work, which is read and reread and argued over for various reasons. And in the introduction to Paradise Lost, Milton says, things unattempted yet in prose or rhyme. So what Milton is saying is that I want to do that which no one else has attempted to do. And chiefly thou, O Spirit, talking about the Holy Spirit, that dost prefer before all temples the upright heart and pure, that he indwells us. He prefers the indwelling of men rather than earthly temples. Instruct me, for thou knowest, thou from the first was present and with mighty wings outspread, dove-like, sat brooding over the vast abyss, going back to Genesis chapter 1, when the Holy Spirit brooded over the waters before he created. And so as he begins to introduce himself in this poem, he's saying, help me create as I write these things. Give me words. And made it pregnant. What in me is dark, illumine. What is low, raise it and support it, that to the heights of this great argument I may assert eternal providence and justify the ways of God to men. Because he's going to be dealing with the great theological questions of Genesis 1, Genesis 2, and Genesis 3, the fall of man and the work of Satan as a usurper in the earth, and how Satan's relationship to God, his fear of God, various things. And there are those who really, really don't like Paradise Lost. Some because of the length of it, they say it's too long. Others because they say, well, there's things in there. I don't believe that's right about Satan. But you have to take it just like a commentary. It's like a commentary on the book of Genesis and a commentary on the work of Satan. You may agree with it, you may not agree with it. But the fact is that he gives you things to think about. That's the thing. Is Areopagitica. This book, and this one is worthwhile getting. You can get it read to you online in the book clubs. But it's valuable in that he deals with what it was born out of was the fact that after Cromwell dies, his son takes over, and he's not Oliver Cromwell. And eventually they bring back Charles II to rule. And what's amazing about Milton and his boldness was he's writing scathing critiques of Charles II up to the day that he's going to be enthroned again. So I got to give it to him for boldness. And how he did not get killed is a matter of wonder. Okay, that he escaped when others got cleaned out when the new government came in. But it is a valuable and interesting speech because he argues after Charles II came in, and then they said there are certain guys, kind of like Milton, who are going to produce some things, and we're not going to let anybody publish until our guys first look at it and decide whether it should be published or not. Kind of like Twitter and Facebook. So we're getting really used to censorship, which is not good. It's not good. I'm not used to it. Okay, I don't agree with it whatsoever. But you need to read him to get the arguments that he gives and his great rhetoric and logic, because this is what he was trained in, logic and rhetoric, in which he talks about the fact that those who are trying to advance the public good by setting forth ideas that are contrary to the current administration should not be censored by that administration, but rather allow the people to read and decide for themselves. So he ennobles the individual man as far as his own conscience and ability to discern and to know and to be able to weigh out and judge. And he argues this all the way through. And he does it very beautifully as well. And says that those who put forth things to the public to read, especially those things which perhaps are contrary to certain other opinions that are out there in the world, that they should be thanked and honored for what they do. Because anybody who puts something out in print has a fear of somebody dissecting it and taking it apart. So that when they do it, they do it to help and honor those who study and have the ability to admonish the state. So anyways, that's a whole other book. Here is his sonnet to the late massacre in Piedmont. And what is interesting in this poem is the view and the belief that these Waldensians, they were the ancient church. You know, what we're told in church history oftentimes is find out who the Catholic Church is persecuting and killing, and you'll find the real church. So he writes, avenge, O Lord, thy slaughtered saints whose bones lie scattered on the Alpine mountains cold there in the wintertime up in the mountains. Even them who kept thy truth so pure of old, you see. It's the ancient church. It's those who have been faithful. When all our fathers were worshiping stocks and stones. Forget not in your book, again, referring back to the scriptures, all your tears are in a book. God keeps the books. Forget not in thy book, record their groans, who were thy sheep, God's book, God's sheep, and in their ancient fold, again, the ancient true religion, slain by the bloody Piedmontese that rolled mother with infant down the rocks. And those are the stories, the terrible stories of them coming in and shoving mother and child and others off the cliffs because they wanted to cleanse the mountains of these Christian people. Their moans, the veils redoubled to the hills and they to heaven. There's a beautiful phrase there. Their moans as they're dying. The veils redoubled to the hills. So as they go down into the valleys and they're moaning, their moanings are echoing off the hills, and then they echo off the hills to heaven itself. God hears those things. Their martyred blood and ashes sow over all the Italian fields where still doth sway the triple tyrant, talking about the Pope and Roman religion, that from these may grow 100-fold. And this again is taken from Tertullian, the church father, who said the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. So Milton is so educated, it's just everything he is saying coming off his lips has a reference to this and has reference to that. And the triple tyrant, there's a lot of discussion on that, whether that was the triple tier that the Pope wore at that time sometimes, or other things. But beautiful poem. Paradise Regained, as I told you, was the poem that dealt with Christ's victory and in order to bring us salvation. Also in this treatise, you can see in the bottom there, it had Samson Agonistes as well, the poem that he wrote on Samson. But then we come to the parable of the talents. We read that together this morning from Matthew chapter 25 and verse 14 through 30. Turn in your Bibles there for a moment. Matthew 25. Let's take a quick look at that. Matthew 25. Verse 13. Watch, for you don't know when the hour comes, when the Son of Man comes. Milton's daddy was a scrivener, so he did accounting, he did various things. This parable is about accounting, that we're going to give an account. So watch for when the Son of Man comes, because he's going to make us give an account of the books, what we did with ourselves. Verse 14. For the kingdom of heaven is like a man traveling into a far country who calls his own servants. Whose servants are those? His own servants. And delivers them his goods. Whose goods are those? His goods. Christ has ascended, and he has delivered the goods to his church by the sending forth of the Spirit. And just the whole idea that God owns us by creation. He owns us. We're his. Anything we have is his. Because whatever we have, we got from him. Verse 15, we read that one man is given 5 talents, another man is given 2 talents, another man is given 1 talent, every man according to his several ability. And then he went on his way. That the Spirit of God is sovereign in his disposal of gifts. God is sovereign. As they say in the Eric Liddle movie, the old guy gruffly says, you can't put in what God left out. Okay. God gives us gifts. 5, 2, 1. Verse 16 and 17. 2 of them double the gift. It says the one goes and he trades with it. He trades with it. And the other one, it says in verse 17, he gained. So these are the words used in the parable. To trade, to gain. Because the biblical principle of using our gift for Christ, improving upon the gift that's given to us, is the genius of being made in the image of God, the genius of God's ways with men, creating them accountable to him. that we are created in God's image. He's given us gifts, and he will bring us to an account as to how we use those gifts. The gifts can be providential, where he placed us. For Milton, it was in this family. The family had wealth. The family could educate him well. And so he understood that he had a great account to give. And the Reformation was a time in which the dignity of work was emphasized, and the callings, that we all have callings. Not just the priests, that we're all a priest unto God now, and that every man and every woman has a calling from God and gifts from God, and to be used for God throughout to bring the gospel to the world. So we have one man who does not trade with his gift, one man who does not gain with his gift, one man who hides his gift in the earth. He makes no improvement upon it whatsoever. And so verse 19, the day of reckoning comes. Here he comes back. Verses 20 to 23, there's a good reckoning for the first two. He repeats the same thing to them. Well done, good, faithful servants. Because I gave you these things, you traded with them, you gained with them. And so I have not just what I gave you, but more than that now. But in verse 24, then he which had received the 1 talent came and said, Lord, I knew that you were a hard man. So here are perceptions. Perceptions people have about God. Perceptions and excuses about God. You're a hard God. You're hard to please. So is that true? That God is a hard master? No, Satan is the hard master. That's the hard master. Secondly, that you require fruitfulness of your servants. And that, as he says, you reap where you haven't sown and you gather where you haven't strawed. You reap, you expect a reaping where you haven't even sowed, which is an atheistic concept, as if God hadn't given us those gifts, as if God doesn't give us life to be able to do anything with those gifts. That you're hard because you want something out of this deal that you haven't even put anything into. And I was afraid, and therefore, because of this perception, it puts fear in this man, and he went and he hid. I hid your talent in the earth. Lo, here's what belongs to you. I'll give you back this is yours. And what he's saying by that is nothing else is yours. How can you say to me that I have to give you more than that? This is what you gave me here. This is yours. So I don't have any accountability. I don't need to be fruitful, is what this man is saying. And so that Christ, when he talks to this man, he says two things: evil, slothful. You're evil and you're lazy is what you are. That's really your character. You knew that I would hold you accountable. You said I was a hard man and that I sow where I don't reap. So why didn't you at least give it to somebody to make interest off of it? If you knew that's what I did. If you knew I would hold you accountable for this. You know I'm going to hold you accountable for it. But here you give me nothing back. And all you give to me are these accusations on the character of God. And so he says he's wicked and he's slothful, and he's going to take from him the talent that he has and give it to another that had the 10. The loss of talent to use for the glory of God. God gives you talent to use for the glory of God. If you do not use it for the glory of God and you bury it in the earth because you think God is hard and he shouldn't expect from me fruitfulness out of my life, he will take the talent from you. He will give to others who may improve upon it. And you in hell forever and ever will be unfruitful. Because that's what hell is. Hell is an unfruitful place where men do not give glory to God except that glory which God extracts from them, which is the glory of his wrath upon them. So let's go to his sonnet. When I consider how my light is spent. Beautiful. I guess among everything he wrote, I like this the best. So the situation is that Milton is blind now. The fact is that he was blind before he wrote Paradise Lost and Paradise Regained and Samson Agonistes. His greatest works, the most epic works that he did when he was blind. And he knew he was going blind, and he was going blind in the service of Cromwell, in the service of freedom and liberty, and what he believed were principles of liberty. And the doctors talked to him about it and said he needed to stop the reading schedule that he had and all that he was doing because he was going to go blind faster. And he made a conscious choice that he had a gift, a talent from God, and it was going to be used until he went blind. And that's exactly what he did. He did not spare himself. So in this sonnet, this beautiful sonnet, we see him set up these contrasts. There's the contrast between light in verse 1 and darkness in verse 2. And we have the contrast between that which in verse 4 is useless, whereas later on he's going to talk about serving, not useless. The contrast between questioning God fondly, he says, and being patient. The contrast between God doesn't need us and we're supposed to serve him. The contrast of speeding along with your talent and just sitting there waiting with your talent. So he sets up these beautiful word pictures and contrast throughout the sonnet. He says, when I consider how my light is spent, there's an accounting term. You're going to see accounting terms throughout this thing because it's about accountability to God. It's about his talent. It's about giving an account to God. When I consider how my light is spent, and with Milton, I am not a Milton scholar, okay? So y'all can pick this apart all you wish. You know, with poems, everybody has ideas about what they meant by them. So I am happy to hear your interpretations of them. But when I see him using the words like light, to me, he is using it in more than one way at the same time. He's talking about the daylight, but he's also talking about his own blindness. When I consider how my light is spent, my daylight hours, my working hours, we call daylight hours working hours, right? Because especially in this day, they didn't have electricity. And so when the sun went down, you went down. And when the sun got up, you got up. And that was your daylight hours. Those were your work hours, those hours in which you could work. Unless you were burning the midnight oil or burning the candle, which is what made a lot of guys go blind. When I consider how my light is spent, my daylight hours, my working hours, and it's an accounting term, how it's spent, ere or before half my days in this dark world and wide. Confessedly, I'm not really sure on that, except he says before half my days, unless he's thinking about, he is about midlife. It was in his late 30s that he was going blind. Ere half my days in this dark world and wide. It's a dark world because it's a world of sin, which brought to us every misery, physical and spiritual. Ere half my days in this dark world, because what brings his blindness upon him? He knows theologically that his blindness comes upon him because of the fall. That's the only way that this can come to him. And that one talent, which is death to hide, to bury in the earth. Don't hide it. That one talent. And I see the talent as both the gift of sight to seeing, to which we are accountable. And he is a literary man who, for a living and for his work and for the gift that God has given to him to be a literary man, to work with words, to read books, and to write things. And that one talent, which is death to hide. I've got this talent. I don't want to hide it in the earth because God will curse me for that. Is lodged with me useless, my eyesight. This talent, because his eyesight and his talent are, as it were, one and the same. Because what is he going to do now that he's blind? He can't read his books, and he can't see to write. Though my soul more bent, and it's beautiful, his desire to serve his God has not diminished. It has actually increased by the challenge and the obstacle that has been given to him. This is a Christian. This is a Christian who loves God and who will glorify God. That though it's lodged with him useless, though my soul more bent now, I will find a way around this thing. I will find a way to be useful, and that my talent is not lost and will not be hidden in the earth. To serve therewith my Maker, though my soul more bent, to serve therewith my Maker and present my true account. Here's our accounting terms again. To present my true account. I'm going to have to give an account for what I'm doing. Blind as well. Lest he returning chide. Because in that parable, what happens to the man who buries it? He's chided by the master. Why did you do that? Does God exact? That word for strictness. Is he a hard man? Is he a hard man? That one man thought he was. Does God exact day labor, light denied? Does he expect from me to still do my labor like day labor, in which I could see, but without that, like the Pharaoh, who was a hard man, who expected the bricks without the straw? Is that who God is? Does God exact day labor, light denied? I fondly ask. And that word, if you go back to at least in the 1800s, it is, I foolishly ask, I weakly ask, I imprudently ask, with indiscretion I ask. The fact is that I love myself supremely. And so I should like a little excuse here. I should like God to start grading on a curve at this point because I'm blind at all, God. So I fondly ask, does God exact day labor, light denied? Can't you give me a break? You know, like those guys that don't play golf very good. So you give them a handicap. Well, he had a handicap. But he says, but patience, to prevent that murmur. Patience is a great virtue. It prevents sin. It prevents a distrust of God. It prevents impudence, that is, shamelessly accusing God. But patience to prevent that murmur. What biblically comes to your mind when you hear the word murmur? Children of Israel in the desert. Always murmuring, always complaining. But patience to prevent that murmur soon replies. There is a swift reproving of the distrust that came to his heart. He recognizes it came to my mind, and I wanted to say to God, how can you expect of me, now that I'm blind, to do this day labor? But he says, swiftly, it swiftly replies. God does not need either man's work or his own gifts. It is wrong for us to murmur against God's providence. But it is also wrong to think that God is in need of our work or our gifts. He is the happy God who owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. He's the source of all things, and he never needs something from us. And so this is Milton's view of the sovereignty of God, upon which he rests his head like a soft pillow. I reply in my mind, God doesn't need my work and my gifts. As brilliant as he was, God does not need either man's work or his own gifts, who best bear his mild yoke. Where does that come from? Matthew, the mild yoke of Jesus Christ. He is not the hard master. He is the master whose yoke is easy, his burden is light, who best bear his mild yoke, his blindness, Milton's blindness. And so Milton not only says is he is a kind master, but he also says that this blindness that you have given to me is a mild burden. It's not heavy. Who best bear his mild yoke, they serve him best in the ministry of humility and faith. His state, his office, his authority, his majesty, his state is kingly. Thousands at his bidding speed and post over land and ocean without rest. He has men everywhere who can do whatever he needs, men of energy and men of power, men who are warriors, men who are literary men, men who are fathers, men and ladies who are mothers, men who are gifted highly. He has them, and they are running for him, just like Milton had run. And post over land and ocean without rest, because we know that we are given these gifts and talents for the Lord, and time is short, and the days are evil, and we are to give ourselves to the work because we have mortality. And the day will come when we cannot work any longer. Christ worked in this way. Thousands at his bidding speed and post o'er land and ocean without rest. They also serve who only stand and wait. And that is him acquiescing in what God has done. Now, he's not going to stand or wait in the sense of, but it's the waiting upon God. Because when you read in the scripture, the waiting upon God, that doesn't mean we're doing nothing. It means we do what we can with what he has given us while we wait to see what else the Lord would have us do. And so, Milton in his blindness, and there's lots of mythological things that always raise up about a man that this great. But obviously, it speaks of his, in his mind, conceiving this great epic work of Paradise Lost and the others as well. But he has to wait until he can have an amanuensis come and write down what he's been thinking. And he gets his daughters to do it at times, but this is not a perfect situation either with his family. His daughters dislike the work. They don't even want to do the work. His daughters, in fact, I don't think they liked him all that well, and they got the maid who came in and helped to cheat him with his funds. And they sold off some of his books while he was blind to get money. So he was not working in a perfect situation. Few of us do. They also serve who stand and wait. And so he learned how to wait. And he did hire, after a while, he married a much younger woman to try to get the household straightened out. And he also would hire amanuensis to come in and help him in his writings as well in time. And it took time from when Charles II came in, it took a while for Milton to even come out of hiding because he had opposed the king so. And we could say that it was the Baptists and other weirdos, the dissenters, who actually were Milton's closest friends and encouraged him. So he learns how to work in his blindness as well. Praise God, we can serve the Lord even when we just stand and wait. So, once again, Professor Seth Lerer, L-E-R-E-R. He's from the University of California, San Diego. I enjoyed his lectures very much. He said, Milton is the great paternal influence on English verse. Some think the greatest poet in the English language. He said, he is the most controversial, the most challenged, the most inventive, the most problematic for the modern reader. He challenges us, he frightens us, he amazes us, he humiliates us, he estranges us from his own work. And he was very self-conscious in his poetry. He said, he is always a part of our collective literary memory. It's a great line. Milton is always a part of our collective literary memory. Milton is obeyed, he's argued with, he's challenged, and he's embraced. You got to do something with him, is what he's saying. Even if you're going to fight him, you're going to do something with him because of the greatness of his writings. Milton quarrels with his father, his king, his Cromwell, his God, and these quarrels play themselves continually between later writers and Milton, trying to understand Milton. Which we could say the psalmist did that too, didn't he? The psalmist quarreled with God and with lots of things. Because he was a man whom I think was a consequence of the Reformation. And I think for us, he's valuable to read. Like I said, at least get the smaller works, a few things, and think about what he wrote. And if you are very daring, you might try Paradise Lost and Paradise Regained. You might get it in a more modern verse if you wish, or you get an annotated one to help you out with some of these mythological references that are given. But to me, I enjoy it, and I enjoy hearing it as well read, because he delves into a lot of Satan and how Satan's rhetoric, and Satan still thinks himself such a fine creature because he was created a mighty angel. And it's interesting to see his view on those things. And so it's valuable. It's been valuable to me to get into Milton. And God has blessed us with a great English literary heritage, which we should not avoid, and I think we should make use of as best we can. So let's close with a hymn together.